And now, to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, Spirituality in an Age of Anxiety. Our distinguished guest today is Dr. L. Sebastian Purcell. Dr. Purcell is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the State University of New York in Cortland. He has written widely on topics of moral, political, and Latin American philosophy, from topics addressing environmental ethics to his comparative scholarship on Aristotle and the Aztecs. He likes to share what Aztecs can teach about happiness and the good life. A philosopher by trade, Professor Purcell has learned that creative and critical thinking can have an impact on living better. And he applies these thoughts to investing, art, and society. He writes about natural goodness, the ethics of cosmopolitanism, and what he calls the normativity challenge, happiness across cultures. Dr. Purcell is married to Elise, who is joining us also this week. The title of his presentation today is From Anxiety to Happiness, ? What the Aztecs can teach us about the good life. In a week in which we have been focusing on fear and anxiety, we felt in our planning that we would need some happiness coaching by now as a way to deal with the anxiety that fear provokes, and also to remind us of the connection of felt happiness in fostering gratitude and perhaps even spirituality to counteract fear. Sebastian has many wonderful anecdotes, and he may also teach us a few words in the Nahuatl language this afternoon. We're glad you're all here to learn this. We are grateful to the Dr. William N. Jackson Religious Initiative Fund for sponsoring today's interfaith lecture. Reverend Dr. Bill Jackson is a former director of the Department of Religion, for which we are all still so very grateful. And I see that he is here, so I would ask Bill, would you please stand so that we might recognize and appreciate and thank you. The Department of Religion is enormously pleased to welcome Sebastian at this time to this podium, and so I now ask all of you to join me in expressing our great pleasure and happiness that he can be with us for this week's important conversation. Please welcome Dr. Sebastian Purcell.
All right, thank you. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure. I'd never been to the Chautauqua institution before, and my wife, who's coming later today, she have work commitments, but she asked me last night over the phone, what's it like? And I said, I don't really know how to describe this place to somebody who's never been here, but it's amazing and you should come as soon as possible. Right. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mostly just jump into my talk, and along the way I'll add some biographical, bibliographical sort of notes, okay? Hopefully also, I don't have too much wind. I will say, as a peremptory note, I'm still recovering from a cold that I got. I visited my family in Mexico. And so I'm going to try not to cough at all into the microphone or sniffle, but if I do, I apologize in advance. Okay, so I titled this From Anxiety to Happiness, and I began thinking about this when I reflected on Montezuma. Before Cortez arrived, he had reason to feel anxious. It's well recorded in the existing texts that there was what they describe as a tongue of fire in the sky for, we would say maybe a comet, that shone every night for almost a year, and that was taken as maybe not a good omen. Also, the roof of the temple of Huitzilopochtli, which is their sun god, that caught on fire and apparently couldn't be put out with water. Also not really a good sign. Finally, the lake, Tenochtitlan is on a lake, right? The lake surged, it foamed, and it flooded a lot of houses. All of this happened before Cortez arrived, and when Montezuma asked his advisors, what do these things mean? They said not very good things, probably the end of your reign. So even before all of that happened, he was anxious. But it's important to recognize that Montezuma's anxiety was probably just a microcosm of the wider Aztec anxiety. In their worldview, they held that our order of things, the creation of people and organizations, had come to be and gone out of existence 4 times already, and that we were in the 5th one. Also, those myths didn't give any reason to think that this 5th one was special, that it would somehow last forever. So they lived, we could say, in a general cosmic anxiety that everything might just go poof. Our modern anxiety, of course, is different. The Aztec anxiety would appear to be rooted in a religious worldview. Our anxiety is rooted in maybe the lack of any dominant religious worldview. That aside, the wager of this essay, or talk, is that it might be possible to look at the way that the Aztecs confronted their own anxiety, living in that world, to see if we can't learn anything from that. You know, when they were planning for the good life, what exactly were they doing? And can we do that too? Basically, those are my questions. All right. So now for some bibliographical notes. I'm going to start by giving you the Aztec worldview understood philosophically, and then I'll move into their ethics. But when I say philosophically, I really mean that rigorously, not as a religious presentation. Until recently, no one really thought the Aztecs had philosophy. As a matter of fact, you could be forgiven if you went through your entire undergraduate education as a philosophy major and you never heard of Aztec philosophy. I think you could even be forgiven if you went through your entire graduate study in philosophy, and getting a PhD, and had never heard of Aztec philosophy. The reasons for this are sort of strange, and I don't quite understand them. What happened is that Catholic clergymen in the 1540s, roughly, transcribed what they could of the Aztec culture. The Aztecs had people that they called philosophers. They had others that they called basically sophists. And the clergymen wrote down in Nahuatl, their language, all of their philosophic thoughts. They went around from city to city and compared and transcribed it. We have thousands and thousands of pages of this, in everything from dialogues to treatises, fathers talking to their sons, mothers talking to their daughters and giving philosophic advice. And this was all recorded in the 1540s. But for whatever reason, it was never considered quite philosophical. And it wasn't until much later in my career, when I had more or less published enough that I knew, okay, they'll give me tenure, that I decided to start studying this stuff for real. I thought, well, maybe even if my department doesn't count any of this as philosophy, I can at least write and study on it. And because it needs to be done. I don't really know why no one was paying attention to it. But we've had it for a long time. By the way, you can buy the codices. They're in English and Nahuatl, dual language. They're the Florentine Codex. You can get that. You can Amazon Prime it, and it'll show up to your doorstep in a few days, right? So what I'm going to present to you isn't in a book. I'm sorry, I'm still writing it, right? So that's sort of where it's coming from. Okay, so here's the Aztec worldview. I wanted to start with this worldview, their metaphysics in particular, because I think it will be immensely helpful in understanding their ethics. A few points about their worldview then. Okay. The basic question of metaphysics, as it's discussed in the West, can be posed in 3 words. The question is, what is there? And it can be answered, moreover, in just 1 word: everything. Okay. Not that that's very informative, but it's true. The difficulty is that Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, by the way, I will sometimes call them Nahuas as well. The reason for that is because the term Aztec was given to them by a German scholar in the 1830s. Alexander von Humboldt, the architect of the German university system. He had an interest in Mesoamerican people. He read their myths, and he said, oh, well, according to their myths, they came from Aztlan, so they're Aztecs. They didn't really call themselves Aztecs. They wouldn't have recognized that name. That's not how they thought about themselves. Just not it. The best term we can use in the field is Nahuas. That means people who spoke Nahuatl, roughly. That's good enough. Okay. So their language, Nahuatl, it's odd. It doesn't have words for to have or to be. So you can't ask the basic metaphysical question in Nahuatl. What is there? There's no word for is. The language is also omnipredicative. What that means is that at base, there's no fundamental difference between nouns and verbs for the constitutive components of a sentence. Basically, everything is a verb. Okay. So it's a process-based, relational sort of view. So asking the basic question of metaphysics is a bit hard. If you pressed Nahua philosophers, they would say, okay, what you're really asking is what is it that exists? And they have an answer for that. Their answer is Teotl, T-E-O-T-L. I'm going to introduce about 3 Aztec words. This is the first one, and it's the one I'll say the most, Teotl. Basically, Teotl is the fundamental energy of existence. Okay. It's a process. So, the Aztecs were what we might call pantheists. All the universe is Teotl, meaning that there is just one thing in the universe, Teotl. We're all parts of it. And the universe is composed of just one kind of thing, Teotl. Obviously, this is not a personal God. It was a divine, they considered it divine in some way, but it's not a personal God. It's more like thinking of nature as God. Westerners, especially Spaniards, are confused when they look at the Aztec culture. They thought they had many gods, that they were polytheists. This is not true. They did have terms, or names for specific gods, Huitzilopochtli, Quetzalcoatl, and so forth. But these are all aspects of the fundamental process that is the divine energy, which is our universe, Teotl, right? So they gave them names for specific aspects, but they're all just part of the same fundamental being. Also, the universe didn't come to exist. So this is true for Mesoamerican cultures generally. It's true also of the Maya. You can buy the Popol Vuh, and if you turn that over, I teach a class on the Aztecs, philosophy of the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca, and my students have to get the Popol Vuh. Actually, I don't even think it's on the back cover. I think it's right on the front cover. It says, the Mayan Bible. And I think, no, not quite. The reason for that is because what you'll find in Mesoamerican cultures is that there are creation stories of human beings, but there's not a creation of the universe. The universe, Teot, has always already existed. What is created sometimes are humans. Okay? So we have myths of that. And of course, the reason why there are multiple creations is because Teot is a process. Remember, think raining and digesting more than a table or planet. It's a thing that's happening. Right? So Teot happens. What else is there? Well, another important difference is that there's no real sense of the sacred versus the profane. Traditional Western metaphysics and Western religions tend to identify the sacred with the unchanging, the eternal, and the pure. You can think of Platonism, for example, if you don't want a religious context. Our world is thought to be the impure, changing, and perishable one. It's the profane world. But for the Aztecs, Teot is our changing world. So the sacred is identified with the perishable, the impure, the mixed, the temporal, and so on. So they don't really have a sacred, profane difference. What they have is a balance, imbalance, or a harmonic, anharmonic sort of distinction. And that's really important for ethics. That's what I want to go to. Okay? So to set that up a little more, I need to introduce one final idea. The idea is that Teot, the fundamental energy of the universe, is a dualizing process. They held that basically reality comes in kind of doubled pairs. It's sort of a brute fact of reality. So day, night, man, woman, life, death, light, darkness, 13:9, probably didn't see that one coming, right? So they're not all the ones we recognize, but they all came in pairs. And the idea was that Teot happens as a struggle between these two sides of a competing pair, right? And that's why the existing literature that we have says that all the gods are one, but they refer to this god as Ome Teot, the dual god. Ome really literally means two, the two god, right? All right, one moment. So, in the struggle of doubles, one side will temporarily win out over another side. And in the Spanish commentaries by various anthropologists, they call this el desajusto, the misalignment, right? Night wins out over day, wind wins out over fire, death wins out over life. But then this is always thought to be temporary, and the misalignment shifts back. Right? It goes to the other side. It's not always night, sometimes it's day, and then it changes again, right? And then it'll shift back again. And the process of shifting is what creates a balance or harmony between the two opposing sides. That is the fundamental idea of balance in the Aztec understanding, or harmony. So things can be in balance or not. They don't have a sacred, profane difference. Okay. So when it comes to the legend of the five sons, this is also a matter of balancing. It was thought that Teot, and we have, by the way, the legend of the five sons, we have it transcribed in a number of different texts, and unfortunately the texts don't agree with each other, and they're not internally consistent on their own, so interpreting this legend is very difficult. I'll give you the outlines. The legend of the five sons basically says Teot, as a process, emanated into what we would call the four cardinal coordinates: east, north, west, and south, right? And that gave the earth a basic shape. What happens then is that each of these coordinates is identified with a god of a sort that creates a human being, right? But east isn't going to win forever. It gives way to north, north gives way to west, west gives way to south, and so on. So this has already happened, 5 times. First 4 times it's gone away, but now you get the idea that actually the myths seem to suggest that maybe it's almost part of the cosmic balance that human beings, that this order that we see around us is going to go away. That's just how they thought about things. So there are 2 implications here. One of them is that in order for the 5th sun to finally, that's what they called an age or a creation of the world, the 5th sun. In order for that to work out so that we humans could live, the gods had to sacrifice themselves. At least a couple of them did. And that's a little bit like Christianity, to some respects. The second implication is that, well, this isn't a soteriological religion. Unlike Western religions that give us sort of solace in the face of death, the Aztec worldview gives us more anxiety, right? It doesn't tell you, like, oh, don't worry, there's an afterlife, it's okay. It says, no, everything's going to go away. You're going to die, the whole cosmos is going to die, that's it. Okay, so rather different. That's why I said Aztec anxiety, it was deeply woven into their culture. Okay, one moment. What I want to do now is talk about the good life. How do you live in that world? Now, in the spring at Cortland, where I teach, I often teach a class called Happiness. It was intended to be for advanced philosophy majors, but it ends up being picked by a bunch of seniors in the 2nd semester of their year. Right, and so just before they go out into the world, they get one last class, how to be happy. And so I begin by asking them, well, how many of you want to be happy? And they all raise their hands, of course. I'm like, nobody wants to be miserable. So, okay, what's important to that? They say a few things, and it turns out relationships are important to happiness. Okay, great. Children, that's a relationship. And so then I will, over the next 10 or 15 minutes, give them a thorough marinating in the data that we have about children. And it turns out that rather unequivocally, children don't make you happy. And so I asked them, how many of you still want children? And the same people who just raised their hands and said they wanted to be happy raise their hands and say they want children. And I don't know if they're being obstinate or not. But I think it says something very Aztec. Just as a side note, I happen to think that probably having children in order to be happy is a terrible reason to have children, right? That's a big burden to put on a kid, right? So I think it also highlights the fact that we reflexively tend to value more than positive emotional states in our lives. If by happiness, and that's all I'm going to mean by happiness in this lecture, just positive, elevated emotional states. If that's what happiness is, it turns out that we often choose other things. And this is what the Aztecs would say. We don't really want happy lives. We want worthwhile ones. That's what matters. So, if you're going to seek the good life, a worthwhile one, you're going to have to start with some basic understanding of what the world is really like. And not the stuff that we tell our children to make them feel at ease in the world, but some realistic facts here. They noted 3 that were important. The first of these was that the earth is slippery. That was their term. I'm going to give you 2 sayings. We have these recorded in the 9th volume of the Florentine Codex. You can go ahead and look at them. And basically, it's a bunch of common sayings that the Aztecs had. Things that were as common to them as, we have sayings like, don't put all of your eggs in one basket, that sort of thing. Okay, so these are their similar type sayings. Okay, the first one is as follows, quote, "The earth is slippery, slick." Okay, these come with a gloss. I'll read the gloss under it. "It is the same as the one mentioned," meaning the one before in the codex. "Perhaps at one time one was of good life, later he fell into something wrong, as if he had slipped in the mud." That's all it says. So let's go up to the one above it, maybe that's more informative. Okay, what's that saying? It reads as follows, quote, "How is this? Look well to thyself, thou fish of gold," unquote. Well, that makes even less sense. All right, the gloss says the following. "It is said at this time, if one had some time ago lived a good life and later fell onto some other one, perhaps he took a paramour or knocked someone down so that the knocked down person took ill or even died, and for that reason the first man, the knocker downer, was thrust into jail. At that time, it is said to the guy in jail, 'How is this? Look well to thyself, thou fish of gold.'" Okay, some observations, because these are not really self-evident. Okay, first, the descriptions seem to include willed and non-willed actions. That is, actions that are candidates for moral evaluation and things that look more like reflexes. Slipping in the mud, not a candidate for moral evaluation. Taking a paramour certainly is. Now, that's a distinction we would draw, but that misses the point. These are taken as descriptions of our life on earth. Their word for earth, this is your second Nahua word, is tlaltikpak. Tlali is like, earth, soil, right? Now, they could have said tlalpan, which would mean a spread out, even, flat earth. But they didn't say that. It's grammatically possible, it's just not attested. Instead, they used a far more circumlocucious tlaltikpak to suggest that the earth was more like a razor's edge, and you're always going to fall on one side or the other. That's how they referred to the earth, right? So it's the first thing. This is a characterization of our life here on earth. The second is that this slipperiness doesn't seem to be the result of an error in reasoning at some point. Bad things happen to good people. The best laid plans are often dashed just as they begin. Purity isn't the goal. The best that we can hope for is to manage the errors that we commit well, not to live an unerring life, right? So that's the first characteristic of life for human beings. People slip up. It's the way it is. Second, life here is transient. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you a short poem by Nezahualcóyotl. He was a philosopher and a ruler of Texcoco, a polymath. Almost 80 years before Cortez showed up. Okay. The poem reads as follows. "My friends, stand up. The princes have become destitute. I am Nezahualcóyotl. I am a singer, head of macaw. Grasp your flower and fan and go out with them to dance. You are my child. You are my precious flower, Yoyotzin. Take your chocolate flower of the cocoa tree. May you drink all of it. Do the dance. Do the song." I would put 4. Not here is our house. Not here do we live. You, too, my precious, will have to go away. So, for someone like me who went through 12 years of Catholic education, when I read this, I can't help but think of something like 1 Corinthians 15:32, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, right? The context is much wider in Aztec thought, because it's not only our lives that are ephemeral, the structure of the cosmos is ephemeral, right? So that's the second feature of life on Tlaltikpak. The first one, slippery. Second one, transient. Third one, happiness. Not really guaranteed. As part of a longer poem, Nezahualcóyotl writes the following. Is it true that we are happy that we live on earth? It is not. It is not certain that we live and have come on earth to be happy. We are all sorely lacking. For is there any who does not suffer here, shoulder by shoulder with the other people? All right. So, happiness, understood as a positive emotional state, is thought generally in Aztec culture to come by chance. It's what happens. Positive emotional states come and go. They would agree with Dan Gilbert's book. Dan Gilbert is a psychologist who studies happiness at Harvard. He wrote a book entitled Stumbling on Happiness. The major idea is you can't plan to be happy, you just stumble on it. Well, the Aztecs would agree. That's the way it is. Okay. So those are the three characteristics of human life on Earth. People slip up, our life in the cosmos is ephemeral, and happiness comes by chance. What are we supposed to do then? They said, you should shoot for rootedness. Rootedness. The word they used is neltilistli, which is also translated as truth. The idea is the earth is slippery, and you're trying not to slip on this thing, right? Take root. That's the good life. It's possible for anyone if you develop the skills to lead it. So, second part of Aztec ethics, on skills and practices, or how to become rooted. Okay. Effectively, the Aztecs thought that there were 4 levels to taking root. No one comes out and says this in a text, as far as I know. This is an observation that I made looking at all of the existing texts and our anthropological literature that we have. One can take root in one's body, one's psyche, in society, and in at least 2 cases, directly in the fundamental energy of the universe, in Teotl. Okay? So I'll go through these one by one. Bodily practices. I didn't really know what to look for. In Western philosophy, the role of the body in ethics is almost completely neglected. Philosophers tend to act as if, like, oh, well, yeah, that's a thing you have, and that's it. But for the Aztecs, it turns out that they had a sort of soma ethics. We have lots of these odd figurines of people sitting in yoga poses, like, lotus poses and various other things. Just lots, tons and tons of these things. And it looks like what was prescribed was a daily regimen of basically doing yoga. You're supposed to get up and stretch and do those things. And the idea is that this enabled you to balance the competing energies of your body. Remember, everything's about balance for the Aztecs, so there are competing energies, and you need to put those in the right format. That's what this does for you. Okay, so first step, take root in your body. It was a practice that all people could participate in, the young and the old alike. Second, our psyche needs to be balanced. Again, dualism. So our psyche has 2 fundamental features: a heart, which is our seat of desires and longing, and a face, which is our seat of judgment. The Aztecs thought everyone's born with a heart. It's not difficult to convince people to want things. The problem is that we're not all born with a face. children have to learn to make better judgments as they get older, and it was actually part of the job of philosophers to help people develop better judgment. So bringing those two things into balance, one winning out over the other, is the goal. That doesn't mean that you're supposed to make all rational decisions in your life. Sometimes you decide from the heart. Remember, one side, el desajusto, one side wins out over the other. Okay? As far as I can tell, they have something like 3 virtues that are similar to the type that we find in the West: prudence, fortitude, and moderation. I'll give you an example, though, of the way that these were different. They were trained in social rights. So part of the way that you would acquire the virtues is by participating in social festivals and things like that. They also had very specific practices, and I'll give you the example of moderation. We have this documented. What a father might do is he might look at his teenage son and think, he needs a little bit more moderation. So in order to help foster that, they would recommend a fast. So he would say to his son, okay, today you get 1 tortilla. That's it. That's all you're going to get today. And for any of you who have ever fasted, you know what that does. You can't avoid the feeling of hunger when you're fasting. You're going to feel it, right? The thing that you have to do is you confront it, and you recognize things like hunger doesn't go on, like the feeling doesn't increase indefinitely. Rather, it comes in waves, right? It comes and goes, and you learn how to deal with that. And so the child, the unruly teenager, would be taught, well, okay, you can eat all of your tortilla right at the beginning. That's what you want to do. You'll be really hungry later on. You can spread it out with little bits throughout the day, or maybe you want to save it up until the end. Either way, you're going to learn about moderation, okay? So these are the practices that they would use to inculcate the virtues. Okay, finally, the Aztecs thought that virtues weren't really complete until they had their specification or their role in society localized. So the third level that you took root was in social cooperation. We have way more of this literature than we do of anything, parallels in the West, Aristotle or Plato say. The idea was this: we're all fathers and mothers or students and professors and day laborers and business analysts, soldiers, civilians. They would have had feather workers and, cobblers and leather tanners or things like that. But we all have social roles, and we can do them well or fail to do so. If we do them well, we take root in our community. We balance our community. So you need to use those individual psychological balance, your virtues there, to balance the community. They were more sociocentric than a lot of Western thought. So that's where, I'll leave it at that for that section. Finally, we have documented at least 2 distinct ways that a person could become rooted in Teot, the fundamental energy of existence. First way, not surprising, given that this is written by philosophers, is by doing philosophy. You can do philosophy. That's a direct way to contribute to the balance of the universe. That's what they said. It's a little bit like Aristotle saying at the end of his book, in the Nicomachean Ethics, that philosophy is the way to be happiest in life. It's like, well, that's probably true for Aristotle. I don't know for everyone else, right? Okay, but that's what they said. Second, the philosophers appear to have carved out a category for their religious counterparts and certain practices that they held. So we know that religious priests used hallucinogenic drugs on occasion, and apparently it was thought that the reason for doing that was that it connected you directly with the fundamental energy of the universe. And the philosophers said, okay, fine, maybe that too. Okay, so the other 3 ways, your body, your psyche, and your community, are the ways that everyone could participate in Teot, in balancing the universe, right? The fourth way is a way for the few, mostly the educated. Okay. So a rooted life would thus be worthwhile, meaningful, for one is rooted in one's body, one's psyche, one's community, and broader cosmic horizon. Fate, being what it is, may prevent such a life from qualifying as a happy one. One might, for example, be in chronic pain because of one's service in war. Service in war, that's how you take root in a community. You're a soldier, right? But that very form of taking root may cause you pain. Or a tragedy may befall you. You may have a child may die, or a lover, or something like that. Nevertheless, this sort of life is still worth leading. That was the suggestion. So a few concluding thoughts here. The first is, but does it work? I'm a philosopher after all. I don't want to just read things and accept things from the authority of other people. It's an ancient culture, great. But does that actually make your life feel fulfilling? And surprisingly, we have work from social psychologists which would appear to suggest, yes, it does. It will, on the inside, psychologically feel like a meaningful life if you do something like this. Psychologists didn't go out to test the Aztec hypothesis on their own. What they did was they tested a bunch of independent ideas that collectively map out the Aztec life. Jonathan Haidt, in one of his books on happiness, calls this cross-level coherence. He frames it slightly differently, but he notes that cross-level coherence is a coherence in your life, purpose, and action across your body, your mind, and your community, your society. And that's a little abstract, so I'll give you an example. The best I can think of is actually my department chair, Andy Fitzgibbons. He's a philosopher, but he's committed to love. That's his idea. He writes a moral philosophy like I do, but he thinks the world would, basically the Beatles got it right. All we need is love, and if the world were just a little more loving, then this place would be better. That's his idea. Well, that's his mental commitment, right? And he leads a life that kind of binds is coherent across all three levels. I'll give you an example of his day. He's also, I would say, I should mention, I think a Unitarian priest. So his loving commitment is towards towards all cultures and faith in the universe. So he wakes up in the morning, he's a Tai Chi master, and he does Tai Chi. It's part of how he loves his body, he says. He then takes a quick dip in his hot tub. He lives in Ithaca. So Ithaca, New York, I should say, not Greece or something. So he takes a little dip in his hot tub, briefly, 10 minutes, gets up, will have breakfast with his wife and foster children. They have fostered more than 100 children. They take the hardest cases in upstate New York that no one else will take. This is how they love individuals. Then he'll go to work. He'll come to my department. He'll do his things there. On more than one occasion, he's canceled the department meeting because he's also a bioethicist, and he sits on the medical review boards for the local hospitals. And so when hard cases come up, he'll have to cancel a meeting and go do that, which is an indication that his work is gaining broader social recognition. So you see his mental commitment to love is also consistent with his bodily practice, his relations with other people, his wife, the children he fosters, and it's recognized as valuable in his community. That's cross-level coherence. And that is what has been found psychologically to feel meaningful to people. That's how your life will feel meaningful. That's pretty close to the Aztec idea. I told Andy about this, and he said, "Oh, well, I didn't know I was Aztec." So That's the internal component. But the external component is, okay, fine, it feels meaningful, but is it really worthwhile? I mean, really. The Aztecs, this was kind of guaranteed by their religious beliefs, broadly religious, and their worldview, but we don't seem to have access to that in the same way, at least, as what they did. So is it really meaningful? Can we take this up in the modern period? These questions, I think, hang like swords over the whole modern experience. I can't really treat them in a conclusion, but perhaps I can blunt their edge a little bit. In what seems like a lifetime ago, I was in a jazz band. I was okay. But what interested me was the way in which real jazz solos, people who were better than me, when they were doing their jazz solos, those were never written down and never recorded. They had a brief, real-time existence and then vanished forever. The brevity of their existence seemed not to count against their beauty, right? Against the value, any value that they had in their universe. Neither was that value diminished by whomever happened to be listening to those solos or not. I think something similar can be said of human lives. Leading worthwhile, rooted lives, the Aztecs would say. If we do that, we lead beautiful, valuable ones. Teot, after all, was never a personal god anyway, only the fundamental energy of the universe. Each of our actions, I suggest, is like a note in a solo, never to be repeated, recorded, or perhaps even remembered. Our choice is whether to make of it a beautiful piece or not, to give it value or to degrade it. In leading a rooted life, we balance and harmonize its aspects. It looks to be a way that we might give our lives a more beautiful shape, to give them value. And if that's right, then it matters not whether our lives are short or there is some transcendent being to watch them. We have it in us, to use a phrase from the Aztecs, to make broken spears of all the threats to our life's worth. And that might just be the best reason anyone has for doing anything anyway. So there you go. Thank you.
Dr. Purcell, as I sat here feeling very grateful for your words, I was thinking on this beautiful day how blessed we are in this lovely Hall of Philosophy to sit at the feet of a wonderful, heart-filled philosopher and to be reminded of what life should be, and that is rooted in meaningful work and being and growing out of rootedness. So I think we have been blessed, and I would invite some of our listeners to come and pose a question, one question to a customer, and perhaps share some of your reflections on what Dr. Purcell has shared with us today. So we'll start over here with Omar.
Good afternoon, Professor. Sorry, boss, I have two questions. That's okay. First question has to do with the metaphysics. It sounds very Aristotelian. There's a lot of overlap, however that came out to be. But in regards to today and how I can understand that, the Aristotelian universe has took a hit. But in regards to this Aztecian metaphysics, the Teot seems like something very interesting. So then my question in regards to that is that, can you turn that into formulas in mathematics? Because that can do a lot to answer today's questions in physics and quantum mechanics and stuff.
Yeah. So, do you want me to take the answer? Yeah.
Oh, and the other question has to do with, in regards to the ethics, is it the community that kind of, keeps people held accountable for the bad things that they do? Or is it more so of this, how you describe nature to be kind of sort of like God? or that like karma, as one of my teachers defined it as the moral law of cause and effect, will come back to get you.
Okay. So thank you for both of those. All right, for the Aztec conception and of metaphysics and its relation to Aristotle and the question of formalism. Okay. I spent a bunch of time in graduate school. I think this is one of the things you're supposed to do in graduate school, is pursue sort of otherwise useless but intellectually interesting tasks. And so for a while, I did work on quite a bit of formal mathematics, set theory, and so forth. And so here's what I'll say. Their metaphysics is, and I'm writing a chapter on it, can be made somewhat like Aristotle's up to a point. Of course, it's a relational sort of understanding, how we're all connected to each other, and it's really process-based. Aristotle is thought to be the big substance guy of metaphysics, sort of thing-based stuff. What is reality at the end of the day? Is it a thing or a relation? Aristotle's thought to be the thing-based guy. The Aztecs would be on the relation side of that. But when we introduce the question of formalism, mathematical formalism, I could use category theory, for example. It turns out that divide sort of breaks down, right? Because you can start defining identity relations. So identities are nothing but sets of relations. And so basically, I think if I were to introduce more formal techniques here, a lot of these, or some of these metaphysical discussions turn out to be maybe not well posed. And so that might have some implications for how to think about reality. I will say that at the very least, the Aztec way of approaching things is very consistent with a lot of the stuff that mathematicians do presently in talking about the basic bits of thought. For the second question, ethics, community, and accountability, I mentioned that the Aztecs were more sociocentric than Western philosophers, but I don't mean by that to say that they were socio-holists, okay? This actually sort of emerged in a number of discussions. I also do work in environmental ethics. So it emerged in a number of discussions in environmental ethics. Socio-holists would say that the fundamental unit of moral concern is the community, whereas most of us would say the fundamental unit of moral concern is the individual, right? So if you're a socio-holist, you think that you harm the community by way of harming an individual, okay? That tends to run towards sort of totalitarian ideas. It's not really defensible. And most philosophers don't even try. But the Aztecs didn't hold that, actually. They never talk about harming the community by way of harming a person. They just say you harmed a person. Right? But ultimately, the way they thought of good and bad was by looking at how, we could say, how virtuous or vicious your action was. And your action could be virtuous or vicious based on how it affected the community, right? This was intemperate because you were unable to execute your job and that doesn't help the community well, or something like that, right? So that's how they would tend to look at moral evaluation. And I didn't really get into that in this talk, but that's the direction they would go down. So you look at the virtues, and those become the means by which you can say whether or not actions are right or wrong, good or bad, that sort of thing. Hope that helps.
Hi, thank you. I was struck by a number of similarities, without detailing them in a long discussion, between the Aztec beliefs and practices with maybe I'll just generalize it and say Asian religious beliefs and practices, Taoism, Buddhism, etc. So I'm wondering where the Aztec beliefs and practices come from. And is there thought that as the first peoples come into the area that they have carried with them beliefs and practices from Asia?
Well, thank you for that. And the answer is yes, but it's tenuous. So there are certain ideas that very clearly are marked in Asian thought. One of them, for example, is the use of the rabbit. It's a symbol that the moon was, they have a bunch of stories about the moon and a rabbit, and how that's actually it's not a face on the moon, but a rabbit on the moon, and those sorts of things. And that clearly comes from Asian cultures, and we can track that. So it's, by the way, that's not peculiar to the Aztecs. You'll find that thought in all of Mesoamerican peoples. So some of it clearly is influenced by coming over from Asia, but a lot of the more specific developments that I was talking about don't necessarily, they might be parallel in some way, but we know that the time at which they were developed in various, say the Chinese civilization, the Aztecs were already doing their thing. So, or at least their predecessors in Teotihuacan were doing their thing. So they had to be independent developments, even if there is some marginal influence around the edges.
Firstly, thank you for being with us here today and for sharing your passion with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And my question sort of follows along after that man's question. I'm an acupuncturist and a student of Chinese philosophy.
Yeah.
And this concept of Teotihuacan sounds to me like the concept of the Tao or of Qi. And you're talking about balance, and I'm thinking about the interplay of yin and yang. And I'm wondering about if somehow these ideas derive from being a culture where humans are considered to be part of nature and not apart from nature, which we see more in the West, where humans are apart from nature and are supposed to be dominating nature, as opposed to realizing that we're a smaller aspect in a landscape painting.
Thank you for that, actually. That helps me highlight something that I didn't mention. I kind of wanted to work into my talk, and I couldn't find a way to do it. Okay, so thank you. I was hoping somebody would ask.
I hope the check is in the mail.
Yes. So, yeah, I do think a lot of this comes from a certain view of nature as like being in a kind of harmonic balance with nature. Specifically, when I was speaking of taking root in the community, one way to harm the community is to harm the surrounding natural environment. So the community isn't like just siphoned off or shuffled off from nature, right? You have to remember that the Aztecs, well, specifically the Mexica, so remember they didn't call themselves Aztecs, so the Mexica were the ones who decided to build on the middle of a lake. And doing weird things like creating latifundios, and that's why if you go to Mexico City anymore, I was just there, I have all of these pictures of my wife standing in various crooked doorways because the city's undulating still. It was built on a lake. It's a terrible idea, but they did it anyway. But they thought it was a way of improving their relationship with the natural environment. Their architecture took cues from it, the way they organized their society, and every city, the basic plans of it and so forth were thought to be in tune with nature and at least to the best of their lights, improving it, right? We might look at that and say like, well, given modern engineering, you should have done this instead, but to the best of their lights, they were trying to improve it. So I do think that a lot of this, something that's close to yin and yang, because again, the Aztecs I didn't mention the word because I was like, oh boy, people will get too confused, but they do have kind of a balancing, the dualizing thought, and that comes from taking their cues fundamentally, I think, from kind of natural biorhythms, and that more or less organized their thought, their day, their life. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
I wonder how the study of Aztec philosophy has changed your life and how you've applied the principles to your life. Okay.
Well, thank you for that. So how does it change my own life? I'll mention it 2 levels. One of them was unexpected. Like I said, I began doing this only after I knew I could get tenure, and hey, I need a job, right? So I did that. Afterwards, I learned the language, and it connected me to my family in a way that I wouldn't have expected. It turns out that my grandmother would always say these sorts of gibberish words. I lived in Mexico for several years, and growing up, I would say, you know, what's abuelita saying? I would ask my mother, and she'd be like, I just don't pay attention to her. She makes up words. And all my cousins and everyone else would just say, like, oh yeah, there she goes, abuelita, making up more words, more weird phrases. And after I learned Nahuatl, I realized, oh no, those are Aztec words. Grandma wasn't talking gibberish. Grandma spoke a sort of creolized Spanish. That's what it was. And I began to look at this when, so I remember my grandmother used to say things like, mira los totonitos. So look at the totonitos. That's not a word in Spanish. And she meant quail. But totonil is a turkey in Nahuatl. And she was diminutizing that and saying, look at the little turkeys. That's what she was calling the quail. And she has a whole bunch of these phrases. And so I began to coordinate what my grandma used to say and her weird practices, because everyone else in the family would just say, well, grandma's weird. She just does odd things, whatever. But it turns out that those were all Aztec practices. She got really angry one time when I sweeped the patio and I put the broom inside. And she was like, no, the broom has to go outside in the patio in this area. And it's because the Aztecs thought that you would sort of bring tlazoli into your house if you did that, a kind of like filth. And so I didn't know that at the time, just like, whatever, one of grandma's things. But all of her things made more sense. So at one level, it was really refreshing to reconnect and learn about like my own past history. My grandma had passed when I was 9. But now I can say like, oh, look, she made sense after all. So that's one way that this study has affected me personally. Another way is that I actually I thought, okay, fine. I can't just read about this stuff. I got to start doing it. So when I learned about, for example, the Aztec technique of fasting, well, it's one thing to read about it. It's another. I'd never fasted before. I'm like, I'm going to try that thing. And I hated it. And then I tried it, a few more times and tried to incorporate it because a lot of religions incorporate fasting to some extent in their lives. And it turns out to be a pretty good way to lose some weight. But it really helped me learn a lot about myself psychologically. So that was an interesting practice. I also do basic yoga almost every day. We don't have a fully recovered set of what the Aztec practices were, but I find that to be tremendously helpful. So I began to incorporate that. And it just makes me less angry at people in the world around me, so that's a good thing. So I began to try on these things because I don't want to just talk about them. If they're worth doing, they're probably worth doing. So those are a few of the ways that I guess it's affected me personally.
Okay, I want to thank you. I learned a lot, and I think it was very interesting and helpful. I have one question, though. I don't know, in the past I've heard about the human sacrifices.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to address that at all, and in any cultures or religions that exist too. So I wanted to know if you wanted to say something, how that was dealt with their philosophy and their beliefs.
Yeah, no, that's an important feature. When I first began presenting any of this, I gave a talk at my local university or college at Cortland, and the president was in the audience, and his first question was, well, what about sacrifice? Right, that was his first question. I thought, okay, so maybe my book needs to have an appendix on this. So here's the thing about it. It's complicated. It's far more complicated than people think. Largely because the practice was not uniformly practiced. I have to start getting into the nitty-gritty about things. Tenochtitlan was the really warlike capital that did a bunch of this stuff. You had other cities that just did it a lot less, or almost not at all, as far as we can tell. Because you remember the Aztecs were kind of city-state based almost. The Aztec Empire was really just an alliance of 3 main cities. So Texcoco, and this is why I'm drawing work, a lot of it from Nezahualcóyotl. He was over at Texcoco, which is across the lake. It was more well, I mean, we have more of their philosophic literature. It was their art center, I would say. Whereas Tenochtitlan was a warlike center. So a note that I can say about it was that effectively, you were supposed to have a ruler and a second in command in Aztec culture. The second in command was called the Cihuacoatl. Cihuat means woman, so it's supposed to be a woman. But another guy, his name was Tlalcael, he put himself in power, and he stayed in power for 4 generations, or at least 4 kings, watching them go in and out of power. And he was the guy who orchestrated the burning of previous histories so that people could, so he could write his more glorious history about Tenochtitlan, ramped up the violent warfare, and used that as a religious pretext to kind of expand the Aztec Empire. So I don't want to say it was all one guy, but I will say that there was one guy who was largely in charge of organizing a religious myth for military political purposes. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, I think, when you look at the Aztecs. As a moral philosopher, when I look at the question of human sacrifice, I just think, well, there's not really an argument to be made. Killing innocent people is sort of a paradigm case of what we call immoral. So that's as far as that goes. But understanding its sources, that's important. As far as its connection to anything that I'm talking about, that's why I was really careful in drawing on the sources that I did. I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't have to develop a worldview that is consistent with what everyone did in the culture. When philosophers look at the ancient Greeks, they read a few of them, Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. They don't try to make sense of broader Greek culture. I'm trying to make sense of a few strands of thought in Aztec culture. So the ones that I'm developing aren't intrinsically connected to any of that, and that's kind of my program. That's why I thought it would be more of an appendix, just because the question comes up so much, and it's important to address. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. At the end of your talk, I just kept thinking about existentialism and Kierkegaard. It seemed very kind of existentialist, and maybe that's not a surprise given your description of the Aztec worldview as being based on this tenuous idea of existence. But I wonder if you had a few thoughts about how would Kierkegaard regard the Aztecs, and are you sort of doing to the Aztecs what Kierkegaard did to Christianity, or was it always there? How might you think about that?
Interesting question. Yeah. Well, when I think about this in sort of Kierkegaard's 3 ways of life, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, I am certainly looking at those dimensions of their life that answer to the questions that philosophers ask. Is it reasonable to act in this way, and so forth, which Kierkegaard would put under his ethical domain? And am I bracketing the higher questions? And the major difference that I would say here is you have to remember Kierkegaard is working with a Christian God. That's a personal God, and that's different from Teotl. Teotl is just the fundamental energy of the universe, right? And so that's a little different, right? You can have the singular relation, Kierkegaard says, with a personal God. There couldn't be an equivalent for the Aztecs because the God of reality is just energy, nature. So in that sense, I would say there would have to be a difference. It would have to be a difference because we can't develop a personal commitment, at least. That would be the one thing that I could draw between the two of them.
Thanks.
So we have 4 minutes and 1 quick question.
All right.
Thanks for the talk. I'm approaching philosophy as empiricist, which is probably why I failed it in school. But if I look at the Aztecs and what happened to them, to the extent that philosophy provides a set of guidelines for living a successful life, they abused their neighbors so much that it allowed Cortez to come in and kill them all.
Yeah.
So to what extent does philosophy provide guidance as to how to live?
All right. So that's going to be the last one? More or less, I think this might end up being the last question, and it's a pretty good one to end on. Okay, to what extent can philosophy guide life? So the interesting thing is, I told you about how Tenochtitlan was really this military political center, and they were the ones that abused all of their surrounding people. The interesting thing, I began with Montezuma's anxiety, but more or less he was talked out of his throne by Cortez. It's a fascinating story. I teach it to my students about every year. But basically, he was an anxious person. Cortez showed up. He welcomed him into the court. When Cortez said, "Hey, I have this palace that you've given me. Why don't you come stay in my place?" He just went. There was no real armed confrontation, and then Cortez sort of made him into a puppet. At a certain point, the people revolted. Cortez had Montezuma go on the top of a major palace in front of the plaza at Tenochtitlan. The masses didn't like it. They threw rocks. One of the rocks hit Montezuma in the head, and that's how he died. Okay, so the man, he led an aggressive military campaign, and he was talked out of his throne. It's an interesting sort of fate. One thing that I can say is that we don't have any written stuff from Montezuma. He wasn't a philosopher. Right. Like I said, most of the stuff that I draw from is from other cities, because all of the stuff that we have from Tenochtitlan is, oh, we won this war, blah, 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 blah. It's not very interesting philosophically. All of the good stuff is from the other cities. And so the thing that I'll say is when you look back at the culture, you'll find that when philosophy declines, when there's nothing good coming out of a culture, that's when bad things begin to happen. And so I don't know if that's to say that philosophy is meant to lead our lives, but at least maybe it's an indication that our human communities are flourishing. So I'll leave the note there.